Hello, this is the last of the 4 videos over the court cases. So after this video, you should have information over all of them. So here are the 4 over the 8th Amendment. Furman versus Georgia and Gregg versus Georgia go together. Furman versus Georgia came to the conclusion that the death penalty was at the time unconstitutional, not because it was seen as being cruel or unusual, but because the structure of how it was implemented was too arbitrary or too capricious. So what the Supreme Court said was, we are not going to put anyone to death at this time. We are not going to have any capital murder carried out until there is a set guidelines for who we execute and who we don't, and a set structure that decides this. Another issue with Furman versus Georgia was the court was noticing, and people were noticing, that courts were putting to death far more African Americans than they were white people, that they were significantly more likely to give a case that could have the death penalty, give that death penalty to an African American than they were to a white man with the same crime. So they left Furman with Georgia and said, hey, come back to us when you have a way to decide how we're going to do this whole death penalty thing. But until that happens, all inmates on death row received life sentences. Fast forward a few years, Gregg versus Georgia then overturned the Furman decision. And Gregg versus Georgia set up what's called a 2-stage process for determining if you get it. And first you have a trial for guilt or innocence. And if you are found guilty, there's then another separate trial for sentencing. So the two are not necessarily happening right at the same time, but you're able to have one specifically for deciding guilt or innocence, and then another one for deciding trial for sentencing to decide if the case warrants a death penalty. So that's how Furman and Gregg work together. Alrighty, Roper versus Simons. America has a long history of executing minors. The youngest in the 1940s, the United States even executed a 14-year-old boy. And then several 16 and 17-year-olds have been given death penalties as well. But how this court case goes, Simon, he orchestrated, he planned out, broke into a woman's house, robbed her, tied her up, put her in his car, drove her to a bridge, and then was dumping her over the bridge. So it was premeditated murder. But court case goes up to the Supreme Court and decided that 17 or anyone who's a minor is too young to be given the death penalty. So that's the court case that decided it, but it had been happening previously. All right, the last of our 8th Amendment court cases is Adkins versus Virginia. And this one came to the conclusion that anyone with a mental disability of any sort should not be given the death penalty because they may not be certain or clear in regards to their actions. So if they are found to have any sort of mental disability, they then are not subjected to the death penalty. They will instead be likely given a life sentence. Alrighty, on to the 9th Amendment and other major cases. First one is very famous, the Roe versus Wade case. So this set the national standards for legal abortions. Previously, abortions were not legal whatsoever. But this court case broke a pregnancy into 3 trimesters and then made it legal to have an abortion during the first trimester, and then put several more regulations for a second or third trimester abortion. And kind of what the main word that then began to be used was this idea of viability, and that asked the question, can that fetus live outside of the womb? Pre-viability means that they cannot. Viability means that they can. So the valence and viability of the fetus is key in this decision. Okay, Planned Parenthood versus Casey goes right with Roe versus Wade. So Roe versus Wade makes first trimester abortions legal. Planned Parenthood versus Casey tries to make it more difficult to access and get a first trimester abortion. So Planned Parenthood versus Casey allows a state to place what is considered reasonable limits on a woman's right to have an abortion as long as the restrictions cannot impose an undue burden on her. The fun part of the words undue burden is the fact that that is pretty hard to judge. One person's burden is another person's not burden. So it becomes very complicated. But some of the things that are allowed would be professional counseling must be given to try to change her mind. You're allowed to delay an abortion at least 24 hours after the counseling. Unmarried females under 18 must have parental consent or a judge approval. Doctors and clinics must keep detailed records. In some cases, even the door widths in these abortion clinics have to be to certain widths. Another one could be married women and husbands in North Carolina both have to be present. Things like that. So Planned Parenthood versus Casey puts restrictions on Roe versus Wade, and kind of the big words there are the undue burden. So we have lots of debates now on what is or is not an undue burden for that. Alrighty. The next one, back uses versus UC Davis. Very controversial case as well. So what happened here is UC Davis Medical School was using a quota system to make the doctors that were in the program, the people who were accepted in the school were on a quota system based on their race and gender. And it was a quota to get into that school. So for instance, let's say that there were 100 spots open. UC Davis was setting a quota that 30 of them were reserved for African American students. What happened though was 2 people applied for UC Davis. One of them was a white man with higher scores than the black woman. The black woman got in over him because of this quota system that UC Davis was using. The white man then brings this court case. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and it's known as the reverse discrimination court case because he argued that the way that affirmative action was being used, the quotas were being used, was unfair. The Supreme Court agreed with him, and the Supreme Court said that universities cannot use a quota system. They cannot say 30% of our spots are going to women, are going to African Americans, whatever. They can't set a specific quota. What they are allowed to say and do is that they are promoting women. They are going to work to have more people involved. However, they cannot set a specific number after this UC Davis case. Alrighty, moving right along. Plessy versus Ferguson. This case legalized segregation in 1896, and it concluded that separate but equal is okay, so that you are allowed to have, say, a separate train car. One train car for black people, one train car for white people. And that was fine. It allowed de jure segregation. Segregation by law was constitutional. Fast forward, and you have the Brown versus Board of Education. These court cases go together. What Brown versus Board of Education decided was that separate was inherently unequal. It reversed the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Because what had happened in Topeka, Kansas, this father tried to enroll his daughter into a school very close to their house, but it was a white school and they were black, so they were told no. Brown versus Board of Education was a unanimous decision that said, no, these schools are inherently unequal. Separate schools are going to be unequal, and therefore we must integrate. And that court case was in 1954. The issue, though, that will be created immediately, and had already been happening, was we have a shift then from de jure segregation, segregation by law, Jim Crow laws, school segregation, everything that comes with it, to what is called de facto segregation. And that's the idea of segregation by condition. So people go to the school that is in their neighborhood, in their district. So what happened more and more was that you got neighborhoods that were more segregated, and things like that. So it's not to say that this ends segregation completely, but it ends legal segregation. Alrighty, 39 and 40 will go very, very quickly. So Marbury versus Madison, this court case establishes judicial review. So this, again, judicial review, we talked about it earlier, is the idea that the Supreme Court can look at a court case and interpret the Constitution for how the court case should be ruled. So Marbury versus Madison allows judicial review. McClellan versus Maryland establishes the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause, again, we talked about this one earlier too, is the idea that if the federal government and the state government disagree, the federal government always wins. So, in some states right now, marijuana is legal. However, none of those people who own a marijuana dispensary keep their money in a bank. It's still on a paper money type of system, because it is illegal at the federal level. And if at any time the federal government wanted to enforce those laws, they could. Because it's only legal at the state level. It's illegal at the federal level. Federal always wins, so they could enforce it whenever they want. Alrighty. Dred Scott versus Sanford, very famous court case. So this idea that property rights over free rights. This court case happened during slavery. Dred Scott had traveled to free soil. He had gone to the north and been on free soil. So he argued that because he was on free soil, that meant that he was free. However, slaves were considered property, so they ruled against him, and that really solidified the idea, too, under the law, that slaves were property, somebody else's property. All right, the last one, Cruzen versus the director of Missouri Health Department. This one started the euthanasia debate in America, and the euthanasia of people. So this stated states have the right to protect a person's life if they cannot speak for themselves. So if someone is in a coma and cannot, as they kind of say, pull the plug on themselves, it is up to the hospital to keep them alive. Unless they have it written down that someone else can make that decision for them, the hospital is supposed to work in the person's interest to keep them alive. So this has kind of started more and more of a euthanasia debate on who has choices, who decides when things like that happen. All right, so if you have any questions on any of these court cases, please send me an email. Thank you.